lack of independence of this parliament has resulted in this government going, or future past governments going from some $500 million in the 1980s to $9.5 billion, because all of that would have come through the process of this parliament, from the cabinet of the Bahamas to this parliament, where every member of this place has a vote as to decide whether the budget of this country is going to move forward. And Mr. Speaker, you would know that even on our side, we would have had a number of our members who would have voted against budgets in the 2018, 2019 budget, who vehemently disagreed with the process by which we were moving. So much so it's resulted in a number of our members even stepping away from the organization. So, yeah, they got fired too. Which is another part of the, English and how this the system operates with conventions. You more than most. But it shows that Parliament has oversight of the whole process, of what takes place from the standpoint of legislation and the budget of the Bahamas. But we take note of what you have said, Mr. Speaker, and obviously as the Prime Minister himself, as you pointed out, and the Leader of the Opposition, from a philosophical standpoint, do agree that the Parliament ought to move back in the direction that it was during the 1980s. But again, it is a process. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The chair recognizes the Honorable Member for Cat Island, Rum Fields, San Salvador.
Speaker, let me first of all start off by indicating that the independence of the Parliament is ordained constitutionally, as you pointed out. It's a historical, it's a historical trait in the annals of our constitutional democracy. And in that, it is that the majority will always have their say. The minority will have their say, and the majority their way. Now, in the context of the operation, I've never heard before. I've heard for the first time, officially, was being whispered that the Secretary of Cabinet is asking the Speaker, the clerk, to report to her.
That was crazy.
I mean, that is unheard of. That even in the independence of the organs of government, there has to be cooperation and collaboration. We appreciate that. And sometimes that cooperation, collaboration is where the lines get blurred. And those who have their way imposes that way to the detriment of what you have observed, the independence of Parliament. And the fact that yes, we have oversight, and yes, we will take our position. But I think what you allude to is a deeper concern, a deeper meaning, particularly in light of the observations made by you that the Attorney General sought to vilify the clerks of the House, right, in respect to some process that would have occurred when the Senate was to meet the last Friday. And that too, I think, highlights the issue of where the lines get blurred, and those who have the way imposes their way without understanding that they are subtly chipping away at the independence of the Parliament. Hence, I'm not surprised to hear the member for Pampu Town talking about a progression to independence. No progression. We are independent. We should be independent. And it is, and we are independent. We should be independent. It is when act and conduct, as which was spoken of by the Speaker, is done and executed, that independence is threatened. and we ought to know our places. That's all. And Speaker, as I indicated, I understand the independence. There's no progression. We are independent. But as you pointed out, you have to check. You have to check when persons attempt to erode the substance of that independence by acts like directing the clerk to report to Secretary Cabinet, acts where the clerk is being accused wrong about matters relating to the processes of our procedures.
The chair recognizes the honorable member for Bamboo Town.
Mr. Speaker, obviously, when statements that are made and the Speaker moves in the direction he has, we end up in these places where we end up with these kinds of philosophical debate. Because when I spoke about the process, Mr. Speaker, we speak about the independence of the judiciary, but yet there is a bill on the table of this House to give the judiciary independence, quote unquote, so to speak. We have in our Constitution the independence of the public service, and there is a Public Service Commission that sees to that. There is no parliamentary commission that speaks to how the parliament is operating and the decision making, who gets hired. The clerk gets hired through the public service. And Mr. Speaker, we speak about where we are. Historically, we know that in 1984, the parliament was more independent than it is today. Sir Lyndon, based on issues that was taking place in the parliament at the time, decided that greater operational control will go to the cabinet of the Bahamas. And we don't need to go down that road, Mr. Speaker. We all know what took place in this House during that time. Well, we've had two other prime ministers since Sir Lyndon. Did they move in the direction? See, Mr. Speaker, when I say it is a process, you and I both know that there is a bill being developed for the Parliamentary Commission. Like we have the Judicial and Legal Services Commission bill that's going to give greater autonomy to the courts. So we need to move in the direction with both of these. So that's the process of which I speak. And we don't need to go down the road to talk about the letter. Because that letter, that understanding took place back in 1984.
Honorable member,
I will end it.
I didn't intend to proceed any further with this matter today. But since you have raised these matters, the deputy speaker and I have had numerous conversations with respect to the independence of the parliament, the separation of powers, the direction that the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association is moving in with respect to the independence of the parliament. The deputy speaker just completed a study at McGill University last year, and he finished his magna cum laude on that course. He was honored by all of his colleagues in the Caribbean region. And coming out of that course, it was clear that the direction the parliaments are moving in the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association is to honor the separation of powers as is laid out in the Constitution of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. So I am of the view that no matter which prime minister it may have been in the 80s that breached the principles of the Westminster system and breached the conventions of the Westminster system by taking away the independence of the legislative branch of government. It was wrong when that happened, and it was wrong when any other prime ministers that followed maintained that circumstance. And so I have in my hand here the draft of the Parliamentary Services Bill that has been in circulation now for more than a year. For more than a year. I don't know what sort of process we are talking about, that a bill drafted by a team of independent attorneys in consultation with the Speaker and the Deputy Speaker needs to go through a process of more than 1 year before the first reading of that bill that gives the Parliament its independence. And when I spoke of the facts that we are facing today in the Bahamas, the facts are that despite the Parliament meeting on a regular basis and having quote unquote oversight of the activities of the executive branch or the cabinet of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas, we have a circumstance here where since the mid-80s, where the cabinet walks across to this parliament with the majority of votes in the parliament. I don't know what sort of oversight a parliament can have when the cabinet can outvote the backbench and the opposition combined. That is happening today. So we need to address that situation, because the facts are that since 1985 or thereabouts, the national debt has grown from 500 million to 9.5 billion. Those are the facts. Honorable members, honorable members, honorable members. So we have arrived at a time in the middle of this pandemic where we need to address this epidemic of the stranglehold of the executive branch over the legislative branch and over the judicial branch of government. The heads of the legislative branch and the head of the judicial branch are co-equals with the head of the executive branch. And now, while there is some fusion between the legislative branch and the executive branch, in that this branch of the government, this parliament, is the only institution in the Commonwealth of the Bahamas where every citizen is represented. And no member of the executive branch can become a member of the executive branch without first being either elected in the House of Assembly or appointed in the Senate. So out of this branch, which is the first branch of the government, constitutionally established, comes the executive branch. And we have let this parliamentary democracy degenerate to an executive aristocracy, where the executive branch dictates to the parliament. That must come to an end. The chair recognizes the honorable member for St. Anne's. Honorable members, honorable members, honorable members, honorable members. The member for St. Anne's has the floor. Honorable member for St. Anne's.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise on a different point this morning, and I won't make comment on what the debate has done so far. But the issue was independence, I think is what you spoke of, Mr. Speaker. I want to ask one very simple question, because my name was called out by you. You referred to a number of us, and I'm only taking me because you named a member for St. Anne's, amongst others. And you asked me to stand up.
No.
Never.
Honorable member.
Mr.
Honorable
Speaker,
member.
Mr. Speaker,
Honorable member, before you put something incorrect on the record,
what did you say?
I didn't ask you to stand up. I asked you to throw a blow for parliamentary democracy.
Throw a blow, stand up, stand on my head. I don't care what you said. You were trying from the chair to direct this member on what he should do and what he should say. In my third non-consecutive term in this House and 2 terms in the other place, I have never had a speaker of either chamber direct me on what I should do.
Honorable member.
They can direct
Honorable
me
member.
where I go off.
Honorable
course.
member, before you go any further down that road,
No, Mr. Speaker.
I never directed you to do anything.
You directed me to throw a blow.
A request was made of you, and you can decide not to accept the request.
Mr. Speaker,
I never directed you to do anything.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In my opinion, when a request is made, or a direction is made, or a comment is made, whichever word you want to do, from the judge of this House, that has a different intonation to me. It might not do to you, but it does to me. So now I wonder whether I am independent in here when I want to say some things, or whether I will be censored, especially after making these comments. The role of the speaker, in my opinion, is set out in the rules. I don't think you can nudge, push, say, throw a blow to me on what I can say. So I hope that's not what you meant to say. I won't be here long because the term is soon running out. And you might not be either, and others might not be. But whilst we're here, as the member for St. Anne's, I am entitled to privileges of this House. And I trust that they will not be impinged on by comments from the chair. Respectfully, sir. Thank you.
Honorable member for St. Anne's, let me say this. If that was the position of the chair, you would not have been given the opportunity that you were just given. No, the point I'm making is I had an honorable member for St. Anne's. The point I'm making is on many occasions in this parliament, the chair has to make a determination on what members are saying, whether it is appropriate or inappropriate. And so it is not unusual for the chair to suggest to any member that a word should be changed, a statement should be rephrased, or whatever the case might be. That's not an unusual thing. And if
something over the line, I have to withdraw it. But my interpretation of what you said this morning from the chair was, I have to throw a blow. That for democracy of the independent, that is, in my opinion, respectfully, is suggesting of what I should say, not what I cannot say. There is a difference. The rule says you can ask me to retract, you can tell me I've gone too far in that direction, or whatever. But the rules of this House, having sat on 2 rules committees, can never say what a member of this House can or should say once he is within the parameters of the law, of the rule. Mr. Speaker, I trust that's not what you intended to ask me to do.
Honorable member, I have already indicated on several occasions that that is not what I asked you to do. But it appears you want to persist and keep that position on the record. I already indicated to you that that was not my intention. Any other member wishing to contribute before we move on? The chair recognizes the honorable member for Fox Hill.
Mr. Speaker, just very briefly, I sit in here as the member for Foxhill and also as government whip. And you know, when it comes to money matters, it is the intent that members vote with their government throughout Westminster system. As whip, whether you have a 1-line, 2-line, or 3-line whip, the members that I deal with have been very independent in determining whether they were going to vote one way or the other. So as it regards the members, I feel and I have seen their independence, notwithstanding whatever pressure the whip might bring. So from that perspective, I feel that the House has that independence unassailed.
Honorable members, we are at first reading, we are at second reading, and committal of bills. The chair recognizes the honorable member for Kalani.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can't do that. Speaker, before I start, I just want to remind this House and the nation that yesterday, myself and the Minister of Health received our vaccination. And I want to inform this House that, yes, I have no side effects. I feel good. And in fact, at 4 o'clock this morning, I was up and out on the streets exercising as I normally do. And I urge the Pdm populace, whenever they're called by the committee who's responsible for the rollout, that they participate and have no fear of receiving the vaccine, as this would help to solve the problems that we face with this pandemic and assist us in opening up our economy and, as you would say, roll out our country. On the agenda item, Mr. Speaker, with your leave, I rise to move that the Public Finance Management Bill 2021 to be referred to as the Pfm Bill, the Public Debt Management Bill 2021, or the Pdm Bill, the Public Procurement Bill 2020, and the Statistics Bill 2021 be read a second time. Today, Mr. Speaker, is a turning point, a defining moment for public financial management in the Bahamas. From the outset, my administration has been intentional about our commitment to good governance. In many ways, we have sought to do this by implementing comprehensive and sound legal frameworks that deliver enhanced accountability and transparency in the management of public resources entrusted to the government by the Bahamian people. In the spirit of the landmark fiscal responsibility legislation enacted in 2018, the Pfm Bill, the Pdm Bill, and the Public Procurement Bills are poised to usher in far-reaching reforms to how we manage our public finances. These, Mr. Speaker, together with the Statistics Bill, are necessary and one could even say long overdue reforms that will take us further along the continuum of improving and modernizing our government regime. Mr. Speaker, while the opposition always liked to talk about accountability and transparency whenever they were in office, they never even seemed to do anything to enhance accountability and transparency. But we are different from them. We are not about idle talk, we are about effective action. Transparency and accountability, Mr. Speaker, are not just political buzzwords for us. And passage of these historic pieces of legislation will once again demonstrate that we are prepared to do the things that are necessary to improve governance and to discourage any form of corruption. Mr. Speaker, allow me to speak for a moment on Pfm Bill 2021. I will begin with an overview of the Pfm Bill, which is designed to address
Honorable member, the lead bill would be then the Public Financial Management Bill, and we'll do all as a
I-
compendium.
Go through each bill. I'm debating it as a compendium, Mr. Speaker, yes.
Yeah, thank you.
I will begin with an overview of the Pfm Bill, which is designed to address significant weaknesses observed in the Financial Administration and Audit Act 2010, or the FAA Act. The bill is weighty in content and lengthy. Have 10 parts and 12 schedules, therefore I will only summarize key components or provisions. When drafting the landmark Fiscal Responsibility Act 2018, it became apparent that the FAA Act required extensive revisions if we are to conform with acceptable best practices for public finance management. Given these realities, it was agreed that the administrative provisions of the existing FAA Act should be repealed and replaced by a new law that aligns with the entity coverage, accountability, and reporting framework of modern public financial management principles. However, Mr. Speaker, provisions relative to the Auditor General would remain until the completion of the proposed Auditor General's legislation, which is in the preliminary drafting stage. Mr. Speaker, as the name of the bill aptly conveys, the Pfm Bill will shift the government's approach to the public finances from the present day emphasis on administrative requirement to one which underscores accountability and responsible management for results or outputs. And under this modernized legislative framework, public sector managers will be required to focus on strategic priorities and will be held accountable for their performance. Like any progressive enterprise, public sector agencies will have to set goals and objectives and the key performance indicators, or KPIs, to measure the success of their operations and programs. And they will have to publish these for all to see. Mr. Speaker, I cannot overemphasize that the major focus of the Pfm Bill is to improve transparency and accountability around the management of public finances and in the governance arrangements of public entities. In keeping with this overarching remit and consistent with modern Pfm legislation, the applicability of the bill, Part 1, extends coverage for the first time to activities of all public bodies. They have been clustered into three broad, although not mutually exclusive groupings, namely public entities, which cover ministries, departments, and government agencies, but exclude government business enterprise, or GBE, as I would refer to later. Agencies, which comprise the non-commercial state-owned enterprise, which traditionally perform a more public policy mandate and are not offering competitive services in the market, and government business enterprise, GBEs, defined as those state-owned enterprises that undertake commercial activities and are expected to be profit-oriented, although also having a public policy orientation. As part of this legislative exercise, Mr. Speaker, the government is also changing the title of the treasurer to that of Accountant General, in line with the nomenclature used within Commonwealth nations, for the administrative head of the Treasury. Mr. Speaker, provisions in the bill also seek to address the current lack of clarity and power for delegations observed in the FAA Part 2 to facilitate more efficient day-to-day operations of the public finance machinery. Importantly, roles and responsibilities are clearly set out for all key positions in these activities for the central government, and roles to cover persons as the chief executive officer's position in the agencies and GBEs. In many cases, Mr. Speaker, the financial management processes governing the annual budget and authorization part 3 have been rationalized, enhanced, and assembled into a more comprehensive and coherent presentation. Expenditure authorization provisions of the bill seek to articulate responsible and efficient frameworks for dealing with unforeseen budgetary needs that have neither not been or inadequately provided for in the Appropriation Act. As contemplated, these will be addressed through the budgetary reserve appropriation, which allows for up to 3% of current expenditure to be set aside under the budget of the Ministry of Finance. The constitutionally established contingency fund or through the standard supplementary appropriations bill process. In another key provision, the bill also provides for the Minister of Finance to approve expenditures for natural emergencies using the specific options I have just mentioned, or through more extraordinary means, including the suspension of existing procedures to accelerate allocation or directing public entities regarding the allocation of their budgets. However, Mr. Speaker, in keeping with the overarching transparency and accountability principles of Pfm Bill, any changes to the annual budget are to be made through the supplementary estimates and a supplementary appropriations bill, so that the Parliament is fully apprised of these developments. Mr. Speaker, the Financial Movement Provisions Part 4 set out the frameworks for authorizing expenditures, including the existing options for moving expenditures within heads, known as firemen, and prescribed arrangements for reallocating expenditures between expenditure heads. Other key financial management elements include provisions that enhance the ability of government to govern cash planning and management activities, allow for the establishment and management of special funds, afford protection for trust assets that are segregated from public assets, introduce more transparent and flexible arrangements for dealing with remissions, write-offs, and settlements, which are intended to secure greater efficiency in government administrative processes without sacrificing the accountability objective. Also noted, Mr. Speaker, is the insertion of new clauses of public investment management of public infrastructure projects, PIPs, which recognize the Bahamas' vulnerability to climate and disaster risk and the need to build resilience in the government's physical assets, public infrastructure, and services. Aside from the central government, it is intended that the applicability will extend to those agencies and GBEs, meaning government business enterprises, that ordinarily receive 50% or more of these operating budgets from the government. Mr. Speaker, honorable members will note that asset and liability management provisions have been enhanced, Part 5, and there is now the requirement for the government to present for debate in Parliament and subsequent publication a medium-term financial asset management strategy. Restrictions are also placed on how excess monies may be invested, and there are explicit and comprehensive provisions guiding the government's investment in agencies or GBEs. Further, enhanced provisions for the independence of the internal audit function and for the establishment of the Internal Audit Committee provide for the continuation of these important activities in the bill. Mr. Speaker, Part 5, which deals with accounts and reports of the central government, is a cornerstone of the bill in my government's stated objectives to establish greater financial accountability and transparency to both the Parliament and the Bahamian people. The major change, ex-post periodic reporting, and contents and publication requirements for the central government now extend beyond the mid-year report to the production and publication of current quarterly reports on fiscal performance that my government had established as a matter of policy. There will be new requirements for the Financial Secretary to prepare for Cabinet and publication monthly summary reports on the fiscal performance. In addition, Mr. Speaker, there is a new requirement for the annual financial statements to be accompanied by an annual report on non-financial performance of the government so that there is a clear evaluation of whether strategic goals and objectives have been achieved. And consistent with parliamentary rules, the bill articulates the role of Public Accounts Committee in reviewing the annual audited financial statements and the annual report on non-financial performance, and the various annual reports and audited financial statements of public entities and GBEs, and reporting to the House of Assembly on these reviews inclusive of recommendations. Mr. Speaker, the government's commitment to drive outcomes and performance is reinforced in detailed entity accountability provisions part 6, which assigns to the covered entities a coherent framework of reporting, publications, and other governance requirements, such as performance reviews. For example, ministries, agencies, and local government are to produce an annual plan outlining strategic priorities and significant domestic capital projects and a statement of fiscal risks. There is also a requirement for the preparation of mid-year and annual reports to cover policy progress made in meeting strategic goals. Also, GBEs are required to produce a statement of corporate intent, a business plan, and an annual report with a carve-out of those where the government is a minority shareholder or holds more than 50% but less than 100% of the shares in a publicly listed company. Members will note, Mr. Speaker, that the bill anticipates the preparation of a code of corporate governance to ensure the covered entities operate efficiently, transparently, and in an accountable manner. The bill requires every public entity and GBE to have the same financial year as the government, and the bill now converges timeline for production of audited financials for all public entities to within 4 months of the end of the financial year, except for the National Insurance Board, which will remain at 6 months. Let me signal that, Mr. Speaker, as featured in modern PFM legislation. The oversight model presented for agencies and GBEs provides for joint reporting of the responsible minister as far as functions, purposes, and policy objectives are concerned, and to the Minister of Finance for their financial performance. This arrangement also recognizes the umbrella responsibility of the Minister of Finance for managing fiscal risk across the public sector, which is essential for achieving macroeconomic stability. Mr. Speaker, the bill also seeks to consolidate the collection of revenue provisions, Part 7, from the various amendments of the FAA 2010, which cover the requirements for tax compliance certificate and the administration and the engagement and appointment of revenue collectors. Mr. Speaker, the transparency and accountability requirements of the bill are supported by an enhanced sanctions regime, Part 8, to ensure effectiveness and compliance. While replicating current provisions under sections 27 through 31 of the FAA Act, new provisions have been introduced. New provisions have been introduced to cover financial misconduct, financial offenses, and institutional sanctions, which are consistent with emerging international practices. Unlike before, Mr. Speaker, we will now have defined operational sanctions for unsound management. And we will have criminal penalties for deliberate malfeasance in respect of the public funds. This is a new day, Mr. Speaker. We cannot have accountability if there are not consequences for abuse of the public purse. This failure to articulate specific sanctions has been a glaring weakness of our existing framework, and we are now fixing it. Once again, it demonstrates that this side is not about pretty talk, but about effective action. Mr. Speaker, as should be appreciated, this is a massive and consequential bill for the management of public finances. To allow for a manageable transition, the bill therefore proposes that implementation be carried out in stages as outlined in Part 9. I now turn, Mr. Speaker, to the Pdm Bill 2021. With your permission, Mr. Speaker, I'll now move on to the Public Debt Management Bill, or the Pdm Bill, which seeks to provide a sound, modern, and comprehensive legal framework for promoting greater clarity, discipline, transparency, and accountability in public debt management operations in the Bahamas. I do not believe there would be any opposition to the statement that the arrangements we have today are too fragmented and outdated, and that they lack conformance with the generally accepted practices for public debt management in respect to transparency and accountability frameworks, institutional arrangements, and debt management strategy. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, the overriding objectives of the Pdm Bill are to consolidate and modernize the existing debt management provisions. Presently, these are spread across Financial Administration and Audit Act 2010, which addresses short and long-term borrowing, the Bahamas Registered Stock Act, the Bahamas Registered Stock Regulations, which provide for the creation and issuance of government domestic bonds, and the Development Loan Act 1990, which authorizes the government to borrow money by way of bonds for the general development of the Bahamas. Importantly, Mr. Speaker, the Pdm Bill would also establish linkages with the Fiscal Responsibility Act, which sets a ceiling on the government's medium-term debt of 50% of nominal gross domestic product, GDP. Mr. Speaker, I will now touch on the salient points of the Pdm's bill. A key part of public management is being able to set objectives and then assess performance against these objectives. In a first for the government, the bill clearly defines the objectives of debt management, Part 2, framed in terms of the best practice goals of ensuring that the government's financing needs and repayment obligations are met on a timely basis and at the lowest possible cost and consistent with an acceptable level of risk. Other complementary objectives are to support development of the government's domestic securities market, and to ensure consistency with fiscal sustainability goals. Institutional arrangements are important to ensure the conduct of effective debt management operations. In keeping with best practices, Mr. Speaker, the bill proposes the creation and outlines the responsibilities of the Centralized Debt Management Office, or DMO, as I would further refer as, and the High-Level Advisory Debt Management Committee, DMC, and elaborates the debt management functions and responsibilities of the Financial Secretary and the Minister of Finance. Mr. Speaker, There is no shortage of global examples on the destabilizing effects of high debt levels on macroeconomic stability. And of course, maintaining macroeconomic stability is a key policy objective of any government. Therefore, it is important that our debt management framework ensures that the borrowing activities across the public sector spectrum conform with sound debt management principles and that there is an orderly access to debt markets by covered entities. As currently reflected in the establishing legislation of most state-owned enterprises, the PDM contemplates that the Minister of Finance will be responsible for approving, in consultation with the responsible minister, all borrowings, whether guaranteed or non-guaranteed, of the covered public entities and GBEs. And furthermore, Mr. Speaker, all covered entities will be required to undertake appropriate risk assessments of prospective debt transactions. Mr. Speaker, in keeping with widely accepted principles for public debt management, the Pdm Bill will mandate that the government develop and make public a more detailed debt management strategy, DMS, to demonstrate that we, as the government, are taking seriously our obligation to ensure the prudent conduct and debt management activities. DMS will basically explain the government's risk performances by identifying the preferred composition of the debt, whether domestic or external, fixed or variable interest rates. The second key accountability and transparency mechanism is the obligation for the DMO to prepare an annual borrowing plan, which is to be consistent with the debt limit approved under Fiscal Responsibility Act 2018. Mr. Speaker, the bill goes on to establish the minister as the sole borrowing agent for the government, enumerates the purposes for which the minister may borrow, and the ability of the minister, with the consent of lenders, to conduct various debt management activities. I should highlight that the distinction provided for in the FAA Act between long and short-term borrowing sources and the limits for the latter linked to revenue outcomes are not carried over to the Pdm Bill. Going forward, the government will have more flexibility in deciding on its sources of budgetary financing within the overriding constraint of the long-term debt to GDP limit of 50% as stipulated in the FRI Fiscal Responsibility Act and the convergence limits established in the Fiscal Strategy Report, and then as set out in the Debt Management Strategy Report, an annual borrowing plan. Mr. Speaker, an entire segment of the bill, Part 6, is devoted to the issuance of government securities, which basically captures the existing provisions in the soon to be repealed Bahamas Government Registered Stock Act 1973. It also incorporates more modernized administrative processes and issuance procedures, including the recent amendment to allow for the elimination of paper-based certificates. In keeping with model debt management legislation, the bill, Part 8 and 9, outlines the proposed framework for government lending and the provision of guarantees to organizations, public bodies, persons, international organizations, or foreign governments. Where these transactions may arise, the requirement is for the minister to discuss requests with the DMC to be, that is, Debt Management Committee, to be satisfied that any lending guarantee would be in the public interest and to require collateral and enforce rights in the event the collateral is invoked. These activities, Mr. Speaker, must also be carried out within the context of a cabinet-approved policy framework, be within limits approved by the Parliament, and be consistent with prudent fiscal policy and the debt management strategy. Mr. Speaker, the government's accountability and transparency objectives for the public finances are deeply embedded in the reporting provisions of the Pdm Bill. Provisions provide for the audit of government debt, the activities of the DMO, Debt Management Office, and reporting to the Auditor General for the Internal Audit Department to undertake audits and report findings to the Minister, and for the Minister to direct an audit of public debt management activities by external auditors with publications of the final report. The capstone is the requirement for the Minister to table in Parliament, alongside the financial statements and annual report, a report on all debt management activities. Complementary provisions, Mr. Speaker, also provide for enhanced visibility of debt operations across the public sector, with the requirement of all public entities to submit to the DMO monthly debt data, which are to be published by the government in a comprehensive quarterly statistical bulletin. Mr. Speaker, to facilitate a more efficient operating model for government domestic debt operations, the bill includes provisions for the central bank to establish or facilitate the establishment of a central securities depository, CSD. A CSD, like the Bahamas Government Securities Depository, BGSD, established by the central bank in November 2019, will facilitate the transfer of ownership through a book entry rather than physical certificates. Mr. Speaker, I now turn to the Procurement Bill 2020. Mr. Speaker, having covered the key provisions of the PDM with my permission, with your permission, that is, Mr. Speaker, I will now move to the Procurement Bill 2020. Procurement systems clearly have a significant impact on the efficiency of the use of public funds and, more generally, on public confidence in government and on good governance. In the local context, the sheer importance of these activities is evidenced by the central government's $1.4 billion in public procurement spending, which approximates nearly 13% of the country's GDP. My government is all about establishing an efficient procurement system, attaining the best value for money spent on behalf of Bahamians, ensuring public access to information on government contracts, and providing fair opportunities for suppliers to compete for government contracts. Speaker, over the years, international financial institutions like the IDB in 2014 and the World Bank in 2017 have cited many shortcomings in our existing public procurement framework. Key among these were lack of transparency and efficient market competition. 2, the absence of legal framework that promotes high standards in line with international best practice. 3, the absence of a designated entity responsible for the development and oversight of procurement systems. 4, Mr. Speaker, the lack of career path for public procurement officials. 5, the lack of reconciliation between budget amounts committed and procurement requisitions. And finally, the provisions of manual procurement processes. While successive governments have indicated the desirability of establishing a modern, transparent regime for the procurement of goods, services, and works, this has been somewhat of an elusive goal. In March 2013, Mr. Speaker, the previous administration sought to amend the Financial Administration and Audit Act and provided for a new public procurement regime. However, while the amendment was passed by Parliament, the new provisions were never brought into force. One is only left to wonder why the then former government never saw fit to bring into force legislation that they brought to Parliament to improve the public procurement framework of the country. Perhaps during their contribution, they can explain, Mr. Speaker, they can explain this yet another example of their failure to put forth their talk into action. But we are not like them, Mr. Speaker. And once this bill is approved by Parliament, it will come into force in the coming months and sooner rather than later. Unlike them, we are not about pretty talk, we are about effective action. Mr. Speaker, in any event, the charge to right this situation now lies with my administration. And unlike our predecessors in office, we pride ourselves on doing what we say we would do. We are moving forward to modernize and transform the current arrangements. The Public Procurement Bill we have before us today is designed to promote economy and efficiency in the use of public funds, to conduct procurement in a fair and transparent manner, and to support an increase in the number of small Bahamian-owned businesses involved in the public procurement space. By design, the bill also seeks to ensure that the Bahamas complies with current and prospective external trade obligations. Mr. Speaker, importantly, the bill is aligned with best practices for transparency. It contains measures that will ensure full openness in the solicitation and award of government contracts, measures that will make the new regime defensible both inside and outside the country. The proposed legislative regime is also comprehensive in its coverage, as it will impact public procurement spending by all public entities, including government ministries, departments, statutory agencies, and local government agencies. Mr. Speaker, at the heart of the bill is the establishment of a public procurement department to be headed by a chief procurement officer, CPO. The essential functions of the PPD, that is Public Procurement Department, will be to provide all the requisite procurement policies and standards to achieve effective implementation and administrative oversight of the full public procurement process and related operations. This would also include the ongoing development and management of the existing e-supplier registry and e-procurement system currently in its pilot phase. The government's e-procurement system already today has just over 2,000 vendors registered in the system, and it is being used by 38 government agencies. The bill will institutionalize the requirements to utilize this digital platform or any other platform as may be mandated by the PPD. Another key institutional construct is the establishment of a public procurement board, with the chairperson being appointed by the Prime Minister and membership comprising the Financial Secretary or his representative, ex officio, the Permanent Secretary of a government ministry in rotation for a period of 3 years. An important difference between this new PPB, that is board, and the existing tenders board is the provision for Prime Minister to to appoint 2 representatives from civil society and 2 members of the public after consultation with the heads of professional bodies within the country. These provisions bring the perspective and oversight of civil society into the day-to-day procurement activities of government for the very first time. To help organize and streamline the procurement process, every procurement entity will be required to establish a procurement unit which will open and evaluate bids and award procurement contracts. Importantly, Mr. Speaker, the bill established financial thresholds for the award of contracts by the PPB and the procurement unit. Specifically, where the value of contract does not exceed $250,000, the award will be made by the procurement unit. Contracts valued more than $50,000 but below $250,000 will be awarded by an internal tender committee subject to approval of the minister responsible for the procuring entity. For contracts valued about $250,000 but below $1,200,000, the procurement contract may be awarded by the board. And finally, where the value of the contract is more than $1,200,000, the board will be approved. The board, with the approval of the responsible minister, is required to make a recommendation to Cabinet for the award of the contract. Where the recommendation is not approved by Cabinet, the Cabinet may refer the matter back to the board for further advice or direct that a new procurement exercise is conducted. Mr. Speaker, the Public Procurement Bill also includes many other provisions related to the bid preparation, publication methodology, submissions, and final selection activities. Seeks to establish efficient arrangements to enhance transparency in procurement activities for prospective suppliers or contractors by requiring procuring entities to prepare annual procurement plans for eventual publication on the department's website and on the electronic procurement system. The bill provides for the procurement of goods, works, or services to be conducted using competitive bidding procedures based on the application of objective and non-discriminatory technical specifications, selection, and award criteria. It provides for different methods of procurement, considering the estimated value of the procurement, the potential sources of the procurement, and the nature of good work and services required. It sets out the bidding process and documentation requirements, outlines what information should be specified in the bidding documents, and requires that all procurement notices be published in the Gazette or in one or more national newspapers and on the electronic procurement system launched by the government in June 2020. It provides for the procuring entity to require bidders to show that they meet the qualifications criteria to participate in the bidding process. The bill also provides for domestic preferences and requires every procuring entity to allocate a margin for domestic preference to promote the participation of small and medium-sized businesses in procurement opportunities. The bill provides, Mr. Speaker, the procedure for the submission of bids, the opening of bids, the examination and evaluation of bids, and for the debriefing of unsuccessful bidders. It requires that notices of the award of a procurement contract be published in the Gazette or in one or more national newspapers and on the electronic procurement system. A few things I want to highlight here, Mr. Speaker, because they are particularly important. This bill will allow the minister to set aside certain jobs exclusively for Bahamian small businesses. This is in keeping with my government's pledge to provide opportunities for Bahamian small businesses and entrepreneurs. Not only has my government set the standard by providing unprecedented financial support to Bahamian entrepreneurs and small businesses, we are once again showing our support by putting into the bill the means for us to set aside specific jobs just for them, where they do not have to compete with larger, more established businesses. It is this kind of access to government jobs by small businesses that will provide them to gain a strong foothold in their respective sectors and eventually become big businesses. This is what this administration is all about, using levers of the state, the levers of the state, in an open, transparent way to empower Bahamians. I also want to draw attention to the requirement that the award of all these contracts will be published online and in the newspaper. It will state what the contract is for, who it was awarded to, and the dollar value of the contract. The PPD will publish a report at the end of the fiscal year that will compile all this information into a single document, and they will publish it. This will help to address all the whispering, the rumors, and the political mischief that has gone on for decades in our country. The citizens of the Bahamas, Mark, I see you tapping. I'm happy to hear that. You sometimes make me feel good. The citizens of the Bahamas, Mr. Speaker, will be able to see who is getting government contracts, for what purpose, and what amounts. It is, Mr. Speaker, after all, the people's money. And indeed, this is the people's time. Mr. Speaker, an important safeguard for proper adherence to procurement rules is that suppliers and contractors be afforded the right to seek review of actions by the procuring entity where those rules are being violated. In this vein, and for the first time, the bill provides for the establishment of a procurement review tribunal, which will adjudicate disputes and complaints relating to the government's contract in accordance with the process established in the bill. Thus, if a bidder believes that he or she was wronged during the bid process, they now, for the first time, have a formal recourse. In other arrangements, the bill set out the grounds and the procedure for the suspension and debarment of a bidder, provides for the proper keeping of records of the procurement and the management of the procurement contract, and provides for the Procurement Act to be reviewed every 5 years by a committee of both House of Parliament appointed by the Prime Minister in consultation with the Leader of the Opposition. Mr. Speaker, to protect the integrity of the procurement process, the bill also includes provisions for dealing with offenses under the Act, with the Financial Secretary being able to surcharge employees of a procuring entity or any person who acted as an agent of a procuring entity public officer for actions materially in contravention to the bill. Implementation of the Public Procurement Bill will be supported by the powers of the Minister to make regulations to enhance the daily operations of procuring entities and procurement units. These have already been drafted, Mr. Speaker, and are ready to be promulgated when the Public Procurement Act is brought into force. Mr. Speaker, I now turn to statistics. At this juncture, I will now round out my presentation with an overview of the Statistics Bill 2021. Let me begin by saying that the government has long recognized the need to modernize and strengthen the existing statistical system to meet the increasing demand for data to support informed decision-making and to meet the 2030 agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals and other international and regional requirements. In an assessment of the existing Statistics Act 1973, which established the Department of Statistics, DOS, many weaknesses were revealed that needed to be addressed. The Act was outdated and lacked important requirements of modern statistical systems, namely independence, transparency, and accountability. It did not provide for a lead agency or a well-defined strategy to coordinate the information production. It lacked evidence of a common vision within the statistical system, with the production of statistics fragmented and no coordination mechanism, no common strategy and program, and no institutional leadership, and statistics are disseminated by other agencies, including the Ministry of Health, the Department of Tourism, the Ministry of Education, and the Central Bank of Bahamas, which are governed by other legislation. So, the Speaker, you had many tentacles, each agency or entity doing their own statistical analysis and statistical data. The Statistics Bill 2021, which was modeled after the CARICOM Model Statistics Bill, seeks to address these shortcomings and align with international best practices for oversight and governance in developing, producing, and disseminating official statistics. Through the Statistics Bill, the government is seeking to establish a credible institution with an advisory oversight mechanism whose mission and functions will guide the strategy for improving the quality, timelines, and coverage of national statistics, which is a vital input to policy decision-making. Among the salient features of the bill is the establishment of a Bahamas National Statistical Institute, BNSI, as an autonomous body corporate to replace the existing Department of Statistics and to be the lead agency within the national statistical system. This new institutional framework is in keeping with the direction taken by many statistical agencies as a means of promoting professional independence, which is critical for ensuring transparency, trust, and integrity in the production of official statistics. Funding of the Institute, Mr. Speaker, will be through monies appropriated by Parliament, fees and charges collected by the Institute, and monies derived from fines compounded by the Managing Director. Mr. Speaker, another key governance arrangement is the board of the Institute, which is to consist of 11 members selected from cross-section of agencies which are involved in the statistical system and civil society. The key is that the board would promote and protect the credibility, integrity, and impartiality of the official statistics, promote and preserve the professional independence of the Institute, and develop policies and give general directions on the carrying out functions of the Institute. Importantly, Mr. Speaker, the board, with the concurrence of the minister, would also appoint the managing director, who is charged with the day-to-day operation of the Institute. Mr. Speaker, the Statistics Bill also provides for the appointment of a National Statistical Committee, NSC, which is basically an advisory board to be chaired by the managing director and with broad membership. This key function is to collaborate with the Institute to develop national statistical strategy, which is to guide the work of the Institute over the medium term and to advise of the priorities of the Institute and the national statistical system. I must emphasize, Mr. Speaker, that this is an independent committee, a factor which is important in securing public confidence in national statistics. The intent is to ensure a participatory, consultative, all-inclusive approach to the development, implementation, and publication of the national statistical strategy, Mr. Speaker, in keeping with the statistical activities of the current Act, the Statistical Bill provides for the Institute to conduct a national census of population and housing, a census of business, a survey on household expenditure, a survey on labor force, and any other census or surveys deemed necessary. The Statistics Bill also provides for the Institute to collect, analyze, and disseminate official statistics, to conduct consensus and surveys in relation to matters set out in the first schedule, and then to have these published. The bill also outlines the way the information is to be collected, whether by a personal interview, telephone, or electronic transmission, or by completing a form and returning the form, and enables the dissemination of anonymized microdata and in the manner as the managing director may determine. Mr. Speaker, the bill enables the Institute to be granted access to all records, documents, returns, and certificates in the control of public bodies from which the information is sought and purposes of the Act. Where any census is being conducted or any other statistics are being collected in accordance with the Act, the managing director may, by notice in the Gazette, one of more daily newspapers and on the Institute website, require any person to provide any periodic or other information, estimates, and returns in such form and manner as may be specified, and information with respect to any of the matters specified in the first schedule. Provisions also provide for any person who is aggrieved by request of the Institute the means to appeal to the Supreme Court to adjudicate the matter. Mr. Speaker, the bill provides for the orderly continuation of employment arrangements, the establishment of pension funds, and for the Institute to engage persons on a temporary business. Mr. Speaker, the bill also incorporates mechanisms for dealing with offenses under the Act. The managing director may compound an offense if satisfied that a person has committed an offense under the Act in respect of which a fine is provided, and the person admits in writing that he has committed the offense and requests the managing director to deal with it. The bill also creates many offenses under the Act and prescribes penalties ranging from $10,000 or a term of imprisonment not exceeding 1 year or $20,000. Mr. Speaker. That's all right. Mr. Speaker, in wrapping up my presentation, I would like to emphasize that developing legislative initiatives is a very time-intensive exercise. These bills are the culmination of more than 2 years of extensive drafting, review, and in all cases, we have adhered to best practice requirements by releasing the bills for public consultation and stakeholder engagement. Indeed, all 4 of these bills were sent to the Leader of the Opposition directly during the respective public consultation exercise. I am advised that the Ministry of Finance did not receive any recommendations for adjustment to any of the draft bills. I take that to mean that the opposition is perfectly content with the content of the draft bills and welcome their swift passage. I cannot, finance would not have given me misinformation. I cannot imagine, Mr. Speaker, that if they had any suggestions that they would not have sent them on to be considered during the consultative phase as others have done. We are nonetheless very grateful to the persons and organizations who did provide extremely valuable feedback and recommended edits during the consultative exercise. Where the government considered appropriate, comments accepted from this process have been incorporated into the latest draft we have before us today. I would add that work continues to ensure that the government would be able to fully operationalize these important pieces of legislation. And while the regulations have already been drafted for the Public Procurement Bill, work has commenced to prepare accompanying regulations for both the Pfm and Pdm bills and other guidance documents necessary to achieve comprehensive implementation of the legislation. Mr. Speaker, we would not have arrived at this stage without the assistance of the Caribbean Regional Technical Assistance Center in drafting the Pfm Bill, which places the Bahamas at the frontier of best practices in public financial management, and for the Commonwealth Secretariat, which assisted in drafting the Pdm Bill in line with the International Monetary Fund's guidelines for public debt management. Both the Statistics Bill and the Procurement Bill were developed under the IDB-funded $33 million loan to improve the management of public finances and procurement and to enhance the government's capacity to monitor progress and implementation of key government priorities. The government expresses its gratitude to these external agencies for their respective contributions and guidance. The government also recognizes and thanks the staff of the Ministry of Finance, the Treasury Department, the Office of the Auditor General, the Department of Internal Audit, the Law Reform and Revision Commission, and the Public Financial Management and Performance Monitoring Report Project Office, the Directorate of the Department of Statistics, for their tireless work that has allowed us to reach this point. Likewise, our gratitude is also extended to all stakeholders which participated in the public consultation process for the various bills. Mr. Speaker, these bills are designed to shape a sound and credible framework for improved management of the Bahamas' public finances and statistical system now and into the future, and will therefore encourage confident and informed participation of Bahamians in fiscal management matters. I therefore commend the Pfm Bill 2021, the Pdm Bill 2021, the Public Procurement Bill 2020, and the Statistics Bill 2021 to this honorable House. I so move, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Member. Is there a seconder? The chair recognizes the Honorable Member for Yamacraw.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise to second as the seconder for the compendium of bills made and first debated by the Honorable Member for Kalani. And those bills are the Public Finance Management Bill 2021, the Public Debt Management Bill 2021, the Public Procurement Bill 2021, and the Statistic Bill 2021. Mr. Speaker, I crave your indulgence just to make mention of a few housekeeping matters in terms, when I first became the Minister of Financial Services, Mr. Speaker, I normally get to office very early. And there was a phenomenal lady who operated as the space cleaner. Very down to earth, sociable. And she basically made the living or experience of being in the ministry much more comfortable because we had nice conversation. We talked about family and everything that makes us human, Mr. Speaker. Unfortunately, she
suddenly passed a few days ago, and her name is Ms. Kimberly Stubbs. On behalf of the ministry, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to send out condolences to Ms. Stubbs, to her daughters. She left 4 daughters and 1 son. So on behalf of the ministry, I'd just like to send out condolences. Then there is Pastor Wayne and Anna Clark. I represented their son on numerous occasions, Mr. Wayne Clark Jr. And unfortunately, he met his demise a few days ago. He's the relative of a lady that's very important to the ministry, Ms. Janice Miller, and my sister-in-law, Ms. Diane Johnson. So I send out condolences to them. Mr. Speaker, I listened very carefully as you gave your presentation this morning. One of the things you made mention of, whether real or imagined, is the state of our economy, it's the state of our economy, and the large sums that are being generated, Mr. Speaker. But I think, Mr. Speaker, I would like to suggest and invite all to accept that the bills here today are intended to bring greater clarity, transparency, and accountability to public funds. And Mr. Speaker, before I go into my presentation, I would like to start as the member for Kalani ended. And he ended by acknowledging the level of consultation and persons who were a part of this process to bring us to this watershed moment where we are actually discussing and debating, let's say, for instance, a public procurement bill. And I remember having, as the bar president, having discussion about the public procurement bill and how public funds we use when especially borrowed from international agencies. And all of us have stories about when funds are borrowed, they're not properly used. And we see buildings that it's constructed. One building did not even have the lines in the building. And so it spoke to the qualification of the individuals who we actually gave the contract to. And so I was a part of that remonstration with the former Deputy Prime Minister, Mr. Peter Tranquest, and a gentleman who I know very well, Mr. Danny Ferguson, the FS, and others, who worked extremely hard along with international agencies, the Ministry of Finance, to ensure that there was proper consultation with all of those who wanted to consult. These bills have been out there, they've been laid, and so everybody had an opportunity to consult. But Mr. Speaker, these 4 bills, as they are presented, are not presented by mistake. When you look at the Public Finance Management Bill that I will go through, Mr. Speaker, and just highlight some of the salient qualities of the bill, and I want to commend the member for Kalani for doing an exceptional job in presenting the bill and with such clarity, because these are really technical bills. But they go to Mr. Speaker to deal with people. And so I want to thank all of those persons who participated. Former Deputy Prime Minister, gentleman who was in my constituency, Mr. Danny Ferguson, and I see other persons from the Ministry of Finance that are here today. All those financial officers that came together to do this. And let me break it down in human terms. When we look at our Constitution, Mr. Speaker, everything that is in our Constitution is designed for the individual to see how best we can serve the needs of humanity, whether or not those persons are in the Bahamas, they're cross-border, or they're coming here. And so that is what it's really designed to do. And so when I say I start where Kalani ends, I want to just highlight, and then I'll go through the bills and highlight certain salient qualities of the bill. I just want to focus on the first schedule of the
Statistics Bill. And it looks at the classification of official statistics, which is adopted from the United Nations classification of international statistics. And when you look at it, Mr. Speaker, it actually encapsulates the UN 17 Sustainable Goals and how we direct public funds to really assist people, individuals in the community, and also to put in place those structures that would ensure that there's good public health, public education, that women and children are protected, that we build good roads, that the judiciary and other entities in the country are facilitated. And so there are certain domains or demographics that the statistics that we gather by the statistics department would then inform us on how we need to borrow and how we need to spend. And so the first demographic is the demographic and social statistics, which look at population, migration, and citizenship, families and households, labor and time. And sometimes people hear about us collecting or gathering statistics, and they don't really, some persons may not know why you gather the statistics. US just went through that the other day. And they were advising everybody to be a part of the statistical exercise because they want to know where they need to put a school, where they need to put a road, where they need to put a highway, where they need to put a hospital. So these things actually inform it. And so the first domain, labor and time, youth, education, health, income, and compensation. So you want to know how much money you need for social services. You have to know how many people you're dealing with. And from that, you generate your budget. And so these different bills ensure, as the speaker identified, that when you generate this budget, that the money is, and that's what the UN Sustainable Goals says, that it actually goes to the place where it was intended to go. And so there's no mistake in judgment when I made mention of the Public Procurement Act. The IDB some time ago made mention of some Bahamians who had told the world that they should never do business with. Because here you are borrowing millions of dollars and it's not going to those individuals at the family island, the school, the healthcare, the funds are not going there. If you borrow, let's say you want to rebuild a hospital and you borrowed $30 million to do that. And you hire someone like in the Public Procurement Act that requires you to have a certain skill set and you just give it to Tom Doe because he's your political supporter. And he messed up the whole thing. The international community from whence you got those funds are very concerned because they're donors that pay into those agencies. And they want to ensure that when you borrow these funds, they're actually used. So the first domain, you say it deals with social protection, human settlement and housing, justice and crime, culture. The other one deals with economic statistics, macroeconomic statistics, and it goes through agriculture, forestry, fisheries, energy, mining. So you see why we're gathering these statistics. The third, environment and multiple domain statistics. You're looking at the environment, regional and small area statistics. And so we know that we live in a hurricane belt. As Mia Motley, the Prime Minister for Barbados, says, that we're not responsible for the environmental catastrophe called climate change, but we are certainly the recipients of the results. When we look at Hurricane Dorian, and then you have meteorological for the fourth one, of meteorological of data collection, and then there's a fifth domain. So all of this statistics, why we gather the statistics, and I'll come back to just deal briefly with the Statistics Act, because I only have 30 minutes to deal briefly with the Statistics Act, to just let you know why we gather the statistics, why it is so important that we have a public finance management bill, because there's a standard that is accepted internationally, regionally, and locally as to how we have to deal with public finance. And if we don't deal with public finance properly, you would find, as we have on Wolf Road, the building where millions of dollars was expended, and the church is saying that they didn't get a dime, but the building for the young people
have not been completed. And at the end of the day, we don't have this facility. So you want to ensure transparency, accountability in public finance so that at the end of the day, you can account for every last dime that is borrowed on behalf of the Bahamian people. And there's some strategies on how you do that. So I turn now to the Public Finance and Management Bill, which sets out the roles and responsibilities. Which there's the preliminary section where you have the definition, then you have roles and responsibility. Part 3 speaks to the annual budget and authorization of expenditure. Part 5, financial management. Part 5 speaks to account and reporting. And Part 6 speaks to accountability. And I want to turn you now, I want to just go through some of the provisions, to speak to some of those provisions and just highlight some of them. First, I'd like to turn, because Kalani had done a very good job in identifying all of the provisions that were in this bill. I would like to focus your attention on financial misconduct, because I think that is one of the most important aspects of the bill, Mr. Speaker, in terms of, because we know how we get the funds, how we derive them. But there are certain things that have been happening in the past, because I deal lightly with this bill to just identify certain of the financial misconduct that occurs under this bill. So just let me take you to section 111. I'll take you quickly to section 111. It says a person or officer or other person with responsibility for public resources commits an offense of financial misconduct if without the lawful authority that person willfully or recklessly incurs expenditure or makes commitments for expenditure of public money. And I quite recall there was a case in Belize where a minister was held accountable for negligently incurring costs on behalf of the government. And a decision was actually brought against that person to repay funds, or opens a bank account in the name of the Ministry or Department of Government or agency of government business enterprise, maintains a bank account for a government purpose outside the Bahamas, dispose or pledge or encumbers public property. Public property is not yours. So if you not go there and pledge it or treat it as if it is yours. Provide incorrect information to the revenue and taxing agencies with regard to agencies of government by business enterprise, Mr. Speaker. And then it goes on to say a public officer or other person with responsibility for public resources commits an offense of financial misconduct if that person willfully or recklessly fails to deliver, that it speaks to the receiving of gifts, fails to deliver to the chief executive officer a gift or donation of a value over $100. And Mr. Speaker, I do recall that Dame Joan Sawyer placed a sign at the Supreme Court building at some time which says persons want to accept gifts, Mr. Speaker, or fails to produce any information in the possession or under the control of that person in relation to the financial management, financial performance, or banking activities of the ministries or departments of government or agencies of government, business enterprise, when required to do so. And it's valuable, Mr. Speaker, that when they have certain information that would help us make, or that is reposed in that person for the purpose of causing us to be fiscally responsible, that they turn that information over, or fails to keep proper records, or conceals or wrongfully destroys information that is required to be recorded and kept under this act. Fails to transfer funds received from a grant,
to the Accountant General. And I'm just giving some areas because the act is very plain, Mr. Speaker. And what I like about these bills is that certain things that you would have heard in the community, like establishing an account using government's funds, where you collect the funds, but you put it on your private account before you transfer it over. This act speaks plainly to that. And so, Mr. Speaker, this is one thing I like about it. Mr. Speaker, says any person found guilty of financial misconduct under this section may be liable to dismissal, so it makes it plain. And my experience has been, Mr. Speaker, that you meet some people in the system, and it's very difficult. Sometimes, well, we take long sometimes to promote, but we take much longer sometimes to remove individuals who are required to be moved. So I like how it makes it plain, Mr. Speaker. There can be reduction in rank, reduction in salary, deferment of increment, withholding of increment. So, Mr. Speaker, it also speaks in section 114 to the conflict of interest. There's a public officer or other person with responsibility for public resources shall not, without the permission in writing from the principal accounting officer, act as an agent for any person seeking to transact with any revenue and tax agency. Mr. Speaker, I would not go deep into the whole conflict of interest, but you swear an allegiance or you swear to do the people's work. So there should never be, I think, to my mind, you should avoid the very appearance of a conflict. And so it's required that when it comes to public funds, Mr. Speaker, that there should be no conflict of interest. Mr. Speaker, I will now move to the second bill, Mr. Speaker, and that is the Public Finance Management Bill, Mr. Speaker, that Kalani dealt with. As I indicated, these bills are very complex, but I want persons sitting at home just to think of it in terms of a proper accounting, bringing transparency to funds. When you hear us say we borrow millions of dollars, you need to know where it's going. There has to be cogent plans produced by different ministers, ministries, the FS, to account for every last time to show that the money is actually went to where they were intended to go. Section 4 of this bill, of the Public Debt Management Bill, Mr. Speaker, speaks to public debt management, and it says the minister shall oversee and manage the public debt to achieve the following objectives. And Section 4A says ensuring that financing needs and the payment of obligations of the government are met in a timely manner at the lowest possible cost over the medium to long term, consistent with a prudent degree of risk. And that is noted. Promoting the development and efficient functioning of domestic securities market. And it also goes on to say ensuring that the public debt is managed consistent with the general principles of responsible and fiscal management, the fiscal responsibility principles and the fiscal objectives in Section 6 through 8, respectively, of the Fiscal Responsibility Act. Mr. Speaker, Section 5 establishes the Debt Management Office. Section 6 establishes the Debt Management Committee. Mr. Speaker, Section 7, Part 4 looks at the functions and responsibilities of the authority. It says the functions of the authority is to manage the public debt portfolio, including government guarantees and lendings in accordance with the public debt management, development, implement, and review the debt management strategy annually on a rolling basis in accordance with Section 12. And so, Mr. Speaker, when we look at public debt management, we would ensure that qualified persons, Mr. Speaker, are hired to assist the people of the Bahamas or the government of the Bahamas to regulate public debt. The Minister for Tourism said the other day that we're spending much more than we're actually bringing in, and how do we juxtapose, or how do we balance, strike an equal balance on the way how we pay our bills and the way how we borrow and the way how we service our debt. So at the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, the IMF doesn't roll in and take charge of everything that we do. The functions of committee is outlined in Section 8, Mr. Speaker. The functions of the Financial Secretary. And I just want to highlight a few of those, Mr. Speaker, a very important position in government. It says the functions of the Financial Secretary related to the management of public debt are to issue directions from time to time for the prior implementation of the intent and objectives of this act, issue directions with respect to each issue of government securities, oversee domestic public debt, external public debt. And so, Mr. Speaker, he's really the person in the government system. As it says, he's the chief financial officer and responsible for regulating public debt and ensuring that we act responsibly, Mr. Speaker, when dealing with public debt. Section 10 looks at the responsibility of the minister in the management of public debt. Section 11, Part 5, speaks to public debt management, the medium-term debt management strategy, approval of debt management strategy. 13 looks at annual borrowing. Section 5 looks at borrowing, Mr. Speaker. I just want to take you to the responsibilities of the minister in relation to lending. That's Section 40. And it says, in relation to lending under this part, the minister shall ensure that lending is made for the purpose and within the aggregate limits approved by the cabinet. So you can't go and lend what you don't have. Sometimes we spend what we don't have and we lend what we don't have. And it's very foolish to do that. And Mr. Speaker, I just want to highlight that these are international standards identified, as I indicated, by the world, our regional partners, and our local partners to ensure that at the end of the day, and I say it so that persons can understand, we don't go broke. We don't go broke, Mr. Speaker. Part 6 of the bill looks at the annual audit by the Auditor General Office established by the Constitution. And it looks at the books and accounts of the department office related to public debt management functioning, including lending and guarantee obligations of the government, shall be audited annually by the Auditor General. And he cannot, that is his responsibility, Mr. Speaker. And he must do it in a fair, transparent, and honest way to account for every dime of the people's funds. Mr. Speaker, there's Section 67 in the miscellaneous section speaks to the Code of Conduct in the management of public debt, the public officers and other persons associated with the issue, subscription, administration, transfer, record maintenance, market making, or in any other capacity shall be subject to a code of conduct and conflict of interest guidelines regarding management of their professional financial affairs. And Speaker, throughout one of the threads that runs throughout these bills, Mr. Speaker, is the whole concept of conflict of interest and also confidentiality, but a code of conduct that is expected by persons who come into the public service and are responsible for the people's funds. Section 68, financial misconduct, a public officer who or other person with responsibility for public resources commits an offense of financial misconduct if without lawful authority. And it goes on, he borrows monies on behalf of the government, agency, or government business enterprise, or pays or converts an existing loan, issues public securities, or varies their terms and conditions, and this is without approval, Mr. Speaker, lends money or other assets on behalf of the government agencies or government business enterprise, issues guarantees or indemnities on behalf of the government agency or government business enterprise, or issues securities for loans made to the government agencies or government business without proper authority, Mr. Speaker. And so, Mr. Speaker, as with the Public Management Bill, the Public Debt Management Bill is designed, Mr. Speaker, to bring, and I'm speaking to one of my colleagues this morning, and just having a brief chat about it. They reminded me that the common theme is to bring transparency, accountability in the process of the way we do business as a government. And Mr. Speaker, he spoke to the Fiscal Responsibility Act that doesn't allow contracts to be made at a certain time before elections. There was also a very important piece in the Proceedings of Crime Act, Mr. Speaker. In the Proceedings of Crime Act, Mr. Speaker, which spoke to unexplained wealth. Unexplained wealth, Mr. Speaker. And I'm trying to rush through. As you see, Mr. these bills are very thick. But I just want to explain to you the thread or the purpose of these bills. And it's so just let me say that, because first I had to do that. I had to explain it when I was walking the other day, that if Ellsworth Johnson comes up and you look at my disclosure, and you see in my disclosure, when I first joined 2 years and I got about $10 million and I cannot explain it, then the government is obligated to take that fund, put it in the consolidated fund, because if I don't have a reasonable explanation as how I got $10 million, and that's for any public servant, and then go about seeing whether or not I committed some crime or whatever to get those funds. So you have criminal and civil forfeiture that's existent in the law. And Mr. Speaker, these compendium of bills bring that process home. Mr. Speaker, the Public Procurement Bill, and I dealt with it in a nutshell earlier. We want to ensure that when contracts are entered into for services to be provided, Mr. Speaker, just Caribbean indulgence for a few more minutes, for services to be provided to members of the public, that those services are actually performed. And you want to ensure, Mr. Speaker, that those services that those contracts that are entered into this bill requires that fit and proper qualified persons are actually providing those services. And also from the Public Debt Management, Public Finance Management Bill, ensuring that the right amount are paid, and so you don't pay thousands of dollars to construct, let's say, a kennel, when you know this kennel is only valued at about $200, to avoid all those different things. So the bill is basically broken down, Mr. Speaker, into 8 parts and 93 sections. It looks at the establishment of the Public Procurement Act, and I remember when I sat with the former Deputy Prime Minister and Mr. Ferguson, now Deputy Prime Minister, and the Minister for Health, and we were remonstrating over some of the provisions of this bill. And Mr. Speaker, I'm happy today that we have actually brought this bill in. From about 5 years ago or more, persons have been discussing the necessity to have an electronic process, how persons would tender, how they can appeal, as Kalani says, and how persons could be treated justly. And then to carve out that portion where Bahamians, Speaker, can get their just due. Mr. Speaker, this bill also speaks to confidentiality. It speaks to conflict of interest, that persons should not, or public officers should not derive personal financial gratification or reward from these contracts, Mr. Speaker. I started with the statistics bill, Mr. Speaker, and all I would say is that the statistics bill, those persons in statistics have worked hard over the years. Hardly ever noticed. I had a friend who worked there. Promotions aren't as reasonable as they should be, and I want to commend them for the work that they do. But their work is fundamental, Mr. Speaker, to the stability of this country, the running of this country, and how, at the end of the day, where public funds, which are sometimes borrowed, paid in by the taxpayers,
is or are directed, as when I started to say, the different domains, whether it be to school, healthcare, to the police, to the defense force, and how we do that. And so those statistics, the statistics bill, Mr. Speaker, in a conventional way, assist the government in directing funds to those different agencies. Mr. Speaker, I've done as best as I can with a very technical compendium of bills, very large portion of bills, to say to the Bahamian people that this is a watershed moment where bills, and I am grateful for the level of consultation that's being done with these bills, but bills that are designed to bring to fruition the 17 sustainable goals outlined by the UN, for children, the way in terms of hurricanes, where you should put communication sites, for women, to decrease poverty, that these bills are being brought today to deal with that. And I commend all and sundry for their hard work. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honorable Member. Honorable members, it has been moved and seconded that the following bill be read for a second time and committed. A bill for an act to provide for the control and management of public finance, for the operation of government consolidated fund, for the authorization of expenditures, for the administration of special funds, for the investment of public money, for the internal audit, for the management of government property, for the preparation of the financial statements and reports on public finances, for the accountability of public entities and government business enterprises, collection of revenue, and for transitional matters and consequential amendments, and to provide for matters connected therewith and incidental thereto. As many, the chair recognizes the honorable member for the Exumas and Ragged Island.
Thank you indeed, Mr. Speaker. I'm always grateful to speak on behalf of the loving people of Exumas and Ragged Island. Today, of course, we are debating this compendium, Public Financial Management Bill, Public Debt Management Bill, the Public Procurement Bill, and the Statistics Bill, Mr. Speaker.
The chair recognizes the honorable member for Southern Shores.
Mr. Speaker, I know that members prefer to continue their flow, and in light of the fact that we're nearing that hour, I'm wondering, okay. Go ahead. Go ahead.
The chair recognizes the honorable member for the Exumas.
Thanks to the member of Southern Shores for his thoughtfulness, Mr. Speaker. Given the sweeping nature of each of these pieces of legislation, I think it would have been preferable perhaps to debate each separately. But there is the line of thought that these bills have lingered long enough, and the task of implementing them should be undertaken sooner rather than later. We support this notion, Mr. Speaker. I point out, though, that the member for Kalani, after 4 years in office, consistently still talks about the PLP. He talked a lot today about transparency, and I just want to remind this House that it was the former PLP administration that passed the Freedom of Information Act, which still has not been fully brought into force after 4 years of this administration being in office. I will say that we support this package of legislation, and we won't be objecting, Mr. Speaker.
Honorable member, the chair recognizes the honorable member for Yamakro on a point of order.
The member for our Exuma, he knows better that there's a process for this, that there's been ongoing public consultation. Yes, public consultation, and this is not something that just happens overnight. And at this moment, I can tell you that the process for appointing a commissioner is ongoing and almost completed. But he knows that this process, when you look at some places who've implemented, like Jamaica, they're still ongoing. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, honorable member.
Yeah. Speaker, I'm not sure what the objection was, but the fact of the matter is that the former PLP administration brought the Freedom of Information Act. They passed it. and it still has not been fully implemented. That's what I said, and I stand by it. But like with any legislation, Mr. Speaker, we support these bills. We are of the mind that they are cumbersome, they're complex, compliance will be a challenge, education and consultation on an ongoing basis will be needed to ensure a smooth transition and implementation. But we're always concerned when this administration pass bills without the complete enabling framework to ensure that they work smoothly and they're properly implemented. Mr. Speaker, let me examine the bills individually. Firstly, the Public Finance Management Bill is clearly seeking to technically codify many of the existing practices in the Ministry of Finance, whilst for most part replacing and repealing the Financial Administration and Audit Act. I'll firstly say, Mr. Speaker, that I don't believe we need an entirely new bill when we could have perhaps amended the FAAA, the Financial Administration and Reporting Audit Act. It does strike me a bit of political in nature that this legislation, which largely outlines what is being done now, should carry a new name. Perhaps the current administration is seeking to place a feather in its cap by having a fancy name to be able to throw out there. But after 50 years of the FAAA, I don't see a reason for an entirely new act, an entirely new name. But this is cosmetic, generally in nature, and not worth hemming or hawing about. The new legislation provides enhanced powers for the financial secretary with respect to public corporations and how they report their financials. I do find that there are some of the sanctions in Section 115 that could be seen as an overreach, particularly with regard to local government councils. It also gives broader powers to the financial secretary in terms of levying surcharges and ability to control how government entities manage their debt. Overall, these are welcome changes, but they seem impractical in terms of how they would work legally unless we also amend the legislation that established these entities. Mr. Speaker, I do have to say that the bureaucratic burden on the Ministry of Finance created by these new bills will be immense. I predict, much like the Financial Responsibility Act, that the Ministry of Finance would struggle to achieve full compliance. Additionally, without intensive training and more resources, this will be a compliance nightmare from the standpoint of the ministry and the government entities, especially when you consider how under-resourced local government authorities already are, for example. And I think these obligations will make it more onerous on local government officials to be in full compliance. When I look at these bills, it appears that the Caribbean Regional Technical Assistance Center, referenced by previous speakers, may have provided much of the framework for these bills without much pushback or adapting by the Ministry of Finance. And again, I would expect a number of consequential amendments in the next couple of years to fit the legislation properly to the Bahamas. I expect there will be some amendments. For example, I also question why the Treasury Department, the oldest department of the government of Bahamas, is having its name changed to the Department of Accountant General Department. I know it's no rational reason, much technical rational reason for this. And why we're doing it now, it appears just, perhaps a cut and paste from some other jurisdiction. I also have an issue with Clause 75 of the bill, Mr. Speaker. This clause seeks to provide that the Public Accounts Committee of the House of Assembly shall review the annual audited financial statements of the government and the annual report on non-financial performance and review the annual reports for each public entity. It also requires that the PAC report to the House of Assembly on the results of the interviews no later than the first week of the 8th month of the financial year following the financial year under review. While I have no issue with the PAC reviewing these financial statements, I do have some concerns that this legislation is mandating how the PAC functions. And I trust that they are not inadvertently putting in place restrictions. Mr. Speaker, this is indeed a separate matter for this House to take up that should be thoroughly discussed and debated. And in my mind, it would be reflected in the rules and procedures of the House of Assembly to ensure that it's given teeth. In relation to the Public Management Bill, this is an example of an extremely complicated piece of legislation put forward by the Ministry of Finance, and we are debating this as a part of the compendium. Again, it would appear that the Ministry of Finance perhaps has outsourced some of its policy making function to Qatar. I'll say that there isn't.
Just a moment. The chair recognizes the honorable member for East Grand Bahama on a point of order.
Mr. Speaker, this is the second time that the member has made reference to the Ministry of Finance outsourcing its policy making or even its drafting legislative responsibility. I'm aware that he has not served in government before, so he may have a bit of misconception of how these bills are developed. But it would be incorrect. And in fact, you might want to consider his words, because it is insulting and maybe even demeaning to those professionals at the Ministry of Finance, some who are sitting here today, but to suggest that there was no, or that these bills were drafted and imposed upon them by somebody else. That's not the way it works. Mr. Speaker, the Ministry of Finance professionals will consult with CARTAC, with IDB, and with a whole host of other bodies, as well as domestic partners, stakeholders, who are professionals and have something to add to the development of the bills as they go forward. And so the statement that I suspect that these are drafted or developed by some foreign body, that is absolutely incorrect. And I respectfully say to the member that he may want to withdraw those statements or to clarify those statements, because that is absolutely demeaning to the hardworking professionals at the Ministry of Work, Ministry of Finance, who put their all into these and produce a quality product to advance the democracy and the transparency and accountability that these bills seek to achieve.
Thank you, honorable member.
The Finance, current Minister of Finance, I believe, acknowledged the work of Qatar. We acknowledge their work as well. We acknowledge the work of the hardworking Ministry of Finance team, Mr. Speaker, and there are some similarities between these bills and other jurisdictions. I'll say that there isn't anything in the bill we find incredibly objectionable. There's not anything in the bill that we find incredibly objectionable, other than the realization that compliance would be very difficult. I also think this legislation is going to have to be adjusted in future to Bahamian circumstances and to our capital markets. I think this is the point that we're making. I therefore expect a number of amendments in the coming years as it becomes clear that some of the provisions are not workable. But we have called for this administration to really get serious with its debt management and appoint a debt management committee. I think we called for that sometime during March, and therefore we welcome this. This bill sets up a debt management office, something that is needed. So let's talk a bit about debt for a minute. Mr. Speaker, this administration expects the government debt to GDP ratio to balloon to 83% by the end of this fiscal year. And this administration projects the government will end up with less debt than is originally projected in the substantive budget, as we see in the fiscal summary on page 8 of the mid-year budget that we just closed debate on. Let me say here, Mr. Speaker, that I don't believe that, and I think it's frankly delusional. Speaker, you don't borrow more and end up with less debt. The only way to do that is to be creative in your accounting or to adjust the gross domestic product number upward. Here's an example. The Public Debt Management Bill on page 27. If you look at page, that's the example I wish to reference that talks about a sinking fund. But if you look at page 8 of the mid-year budget document, we will see a note at the very bottom. The note reads, recurrent expenditures have been adjusted to exclude sinking fund balances, as these represent investments in future financial assets and therefore do not impact the overall deficit position. Page 8 of the midterm budget estimate.
Okay.
I want to note that this makes little sense and appears to be a tactic to make the situation look better. You can't be serious about managing public debt when you don't acknowledge that it's there. But let's look at the sinking fund idea. In November 2017, this administration placed a 10-year, $750 million bond on the US market. That bond attracted a rate of 6%. You note that now we're attracting rates nearly 9%. But let me stick with 2017 bond for a minute. We told you not to do it, not to have this mad dash to pay these so-called outstanding unbudgeted bills from the PLP that you like to talk about, but rather make arrangements to match realistic cash flows with the payoff of those bills. But you thought it prudent to borrow to do so. No problem, not your policy. But you didn't listen, and you borrowed the money. The first repayment of the principal of this loan is due November 2026. That's $250 million, 5 years from now. The second payment is due November 2027, about $250 million. And the final repayment will be due November 2028. Again, $250 million. It's a lot of money to secure and to source a few years from now. And we told them so. But they said they were going to set up a sinking fund to ensure the money was there when the time came, and set up a sinking fund. They did. Up to July 2020, the government did contribute to the sinking fund to pay these loans back, but two things apparently changed this fiscal year. This administration stopped contributing to the sinking fund, as well as we stopped recording the sinking fund as an expense entirely. The government, this administration, 6-month fiscal snapshot says.
Chair recognizes the honorable member for East Grand Bahama on a point of order.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I don't know what the member is trying to convey, but he's misleading. First off, the government need, not desire, need to borrow continuously to finance existing debt repayment. It's historical, goes all the way back to independence. In fact, previously independence. We've always had deficit spending. And we have not paid back substantially any of our borrowing from independence, Mr. Speaker. Never done it. Secondly, Mr. Speaker, the member obviously doesn't understand the purpose of a sinking fund. A sinking fund is not an expense, Mr. Speaker. It is a provision that a government voluntarily, because it's not required, that voluntarily says that we're going to be responsible about the debt that we have and set aside some funds such that when these debts become mature, that we don't have to borrow again like we have been doing to pay them, but that we would have these funds set aside to retire the debt. Obviously, given Hurricane Dorian, given the pandemic, it is impractical to set aside funds for this particular purpose, because there is a demand for funds to meet emergency and support expenditure. So I don't know what the member is trying to convey, but he's absolutely misleading if he's trying to say that the expense, the sinking fund is an expense of the government that has to be budgeted. It is not so. It is not so. And this government is the first to try to set aside those funds, as has been already acknowledged, as he acknowledged. So again, let's not mislead the Bahamian people.
Well, let me say two things. Let me say two things, Mr. Speaker. Sinking funds, I understand quite well. I'll have the minister to know. And secondly, Mr. Speaker, I stand by my statement, right? And thirdly, I would caution the the former Minister of Finance in relation to his very condescending tone, Mr. Speaker. The former DPM. We've addressed this before, Mr. Speaker, and I'm minded to continue the substance of my presentation and not be distracted by
Honorable member.
unnecessary deflections, Mr. Speaker.
The member for Chair recognizes the honorable member for East Grand Bahama.
Let me just say that it was certainly not my intention to be condescending. And if the member takes it that way, then I do apologize to him for that. But what I have done and what I am trying to do is to explain what he appears to be misunderstanding. And for the Bahamian people, even if the member does not accept it, for the Bahamian people, I'm trying to explain what it is that the sinking fund is all about, and how we accumulated the debt, and how we have to continuously borrow, unfortunately, to retire current payments because we do not have the cash.
Speaker, we're approaching the luncheon hour, and I know that the member wants to be consistently repetitive on this point. But let me just make clear that my remarks here are always studied and always drawn from best practice and always reference the facts as presented by them, Ministry of Finance, Speaker. And I made reference to the footnote on page 8 of these estimates. And maybe the former Minister of Finance can check it out and acquaint himself with it, Mr. Speaker.
The chair recognizes the member for East Grand Bahama.
I don't know how much more I can say about this, and I'm going to leave it alone because I think the member understands. The government of the Bahamas presented a fiscal strategy report that governs the projections for the next 3 years. In that, there would have been certain assumptions, and those assumptions would be outlined in that fiscal strategy report. Obviously, there were adjustments that would be necessary as a result of current circumstances. And those exceptions were brought to this Parliament to be accepted. Because, again, circumstances intervened, and certain provisions of the strategy report, as well as the budget, would have had to be amended. That's not politics. That's not somebody getting it wrong. That's just the facts of the circumstances as they go. And if the government, or if the opposition is lucky enough to become government, they will recognize that circumstances change, and you have to adjust. That's brought here to Parliament. That's the beauty of the fiscal strategy report, the strategic report, that they said that they would roll back. You have to come to Parliament and explain it. We've done that. So again, there's no mystery about this. We tried to be transparent about it.
Speaker, I have no idea what the member for East Grand Bahama is talking about. He's not focused on the point I am making, certainly, Mr. Speaker. And, you know, if he wishes to make a presentation, I'm sure he has the opportunity to do so. Speaker, I stand by the words that I'm saying. I stand by the references I make to page 8 in this report. I simply make a point to what has been done is apparently now being changed, Mr. Speaker. And I'm saying that as a result of these changes, the books look better, Mr. Speaker. That's all I'm saying. So the consistent reflection about, you know, all and sundry and any number of things, Mr. Speaker, really bears no relevance to what I'm saying. And I'd be happy to revisit this point after lunch if I might be granted an extra 2 minutes just to backtrack and then move forward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, honorable member. The chair recognizes the honorable member for Southern Shores.
Mr. Speaker, I move that the business of this House suspend for the luncheon break and return at 3 p.m. today's date, Monday, March 15th, 2021.
Is there a second now? Honorable members, it has been moved and seconded that the business of this House suspend until 3 p.m. this afternoon. As the many members that are in favor will remain seated, those who oppose will stand. The business of this House stands suspended until 3 p.m. this afternoon.